Okay, so an interview was recently conducted with some of the biggest manga authors in the world, in particular from Weekly Shonen Jump, and within this interview they dropped a lot of jewels and gems. In particular, giving a lot of insight into when they first started creating manga, a lot of tidbits for upcoming mangaka, and just in general, a lot of major knowledge for people that want to know about the manga industry and their experiences. And you're probably thinking, okay, well, who's these authors? Well, they got Gege Akutami from Jujutsu Kaisen, they got Ichiro Oda from One Piece, Tite Kubo from Bleach and Burn the Witch, Demon Slayer's Koyoharo Gotoge, Demizu Posca, the artist of the Promise Neverland, Tatsuki Fujimoto, the author of Fire Punch, and the legendary and absolutely insanely big Chainsaw Man, My Hero Academia's Kohei Horikoshi, Hideaki Sorachi from Gintama, and many more. So we're going to be taking a look at these interviews and seeing what we can get from all of this knowledge that these incredible creators have to offer. Starting with Gege Akutami from Jujutsu Kaisen. What knowledge would have benefited you when starting your manga career? I wish my managing editor had sat me down and said, make your word balloons bigger and don't break up the word balloons so much. People don't realize how big of a deal lettering actually is and trying to fit the words properly and make them look all cohesive. It is a job in and of itself. What did you do first after deciding to become a manga author? Example, practicing, strategizing, and or did you have an efficient way to practice? Get in the habit of finishing what you start. Work on your ability to explain in words what you find exciting or boring about a given series. I find myself unable to focus on the art, so I would just do lots of quick, sketchy figure drawings. When I do a properly lit and shaded sketch, nowadays, I regret that I didn't adopt that habit sooner. I also regret having created so many rough storyboards, but basically no finished drafts. So essentially it would have benefited Gege Akutami to have actually had things already done and set in stone before actually moving forward. What are you mindful of when revising your own storyboards, either when self-editing or taking advice from the editorial staff? Since my work is published in a magazine for children, I'm always sure to listen when an editor tells me this part is hard to understand. I try to plan out my storyboards with a strong sense of overall balance, and there's been many times when adjusting them based on the advice of others felt like removing pieces from a Jenga tower, which led to collapse and failure. Changing minor details is fine, but generally, I'd rather put in the work and start over from scratch instead of fixing up a bunch of things in my storyboards. Yes, it can get complicated, and also if you remove an integral piece of the story, things will start feeling like it's absolutely incoherent, unsensible, and just in general, a flat-out mess. I mean, that's one of the big reasons why people hate when anime change things from the manga, because then certain aspects later on in the story will be a little bit like, huh? Is there any way you could have been better prepared before your serialization began? I wish I had more experience doing proper drafts, so it seems as though Gege Akutami really had a tough time with doing drafts. What do you bear in mind when creating manga? Personal themes and throughliness. I'm not trying to get people from my own generation to come away thinking I have good taste, okay? What's your approach to creating strong, memorable characters? Their mere appearance should elicit big laughs, emphasis through repetition, some sort of jarring discrepancy between expectations and reality. How should one practice creating those strong characters? It comes down to imagining how other people will feel about your characters, which is hard. How many works pages did you create leading up to your first real submission? How many works pages from that first submission until your magazine debut? Around age 20, I tried to get my first short work, that is a completed draft, into a magazine called Aoharu. I called about bringing in my work, but they sort of blew me off in a non-committal way, so I gave up. After that, I got 2 different one-shots into a sister magazine, 2 more one-shots into Weekly Shonen Jump, a 4-chapter serialization in the monthly magazine. That run would eventually become Jujutsu Kaisen Volume 0, and then finally, my serialization in Weekly Shonen Jump. Between my first one-shot in the sister magazine and my second one in the main magazine, I honed my skills working under Kano-sensei, Kiss X Death. What's your approach to creating manga that's readable? I let my art blast right past the safety and trim lines in order to guide the reader's eye. That said, I tend to sacrifice readability for what I find interesting, so don't treat me like some sort of role model. How long does it take to create the storyboards for a single 19-page chapter of manga? It depends on the chapter, but usually around half a day. The weird thing is, even when I got the story all thought out and I'm not unsure of anything, it can take me 12 hours or more just to get started on the storyboards, which only end up taking 6 or 7 hours to finish. If, like me, you're the type of person who spends 3 hours psyching yourself up for a 30-minute task, you might be in trouble if you're ever serialized in a manga magazine. How long does it take to finish the full draft for a single 19-page chapter of manga? About 5 days. My focus is absolute garbage. Beyond creating your storyboards, what do you do to come up with ideas and plot points for your work? I recommend reading short stories. Some of my best ideas come to me when I'm imagining how I would flesh out a short story into something longer. Is there anything you've referenced when creating your one-shots? Collections of shorts from Haruko Ichikawa sensei and Tomoko Yamashita sensei. With one-shots, I'm thinking it might be better to make everything revolve around the intimate human drama rather than the setup and the world. And again, that was Gege Akutami from Jujutsu Kaisen. Next up, we got Eiichiro Oda, creator of One Piece. What knowledge would have benefited you when starting your manga career? Knowing what storyboards actually are. I would start telling my stories using full-on underdrawings instead. This was the era before the internet existed. What did you do first after deciding to become a manga author? Example, practicing, strategizing, and or did you have an efficient way to practice? Drawing things realistically. Drawing Disney cartoons frame by frame. Drawing fashion show models at the same speed they popped out onto the catwalk. What are you mindful of when revising your own storyboards, either when self-editing or taking advice from an editorial? Coming to grips with my editor saying, right, that turned out how I thought. I start thinking about what led them to expect what was coming. A lot of the time, there's no clear reason. Is there any way you could have been better prepared before your serialization began? All the thinking in the world can't fully prepare you, so I say just go for it. And once you've made it, then start panicking. You'll figure it out. Human beings are amazing that way. What do you bear in mind when creating manga? I want to show readers something new. What's your approach to creating strong, memorable characters? Distinct visual traits? How should one practice creating those strong characters? Observe people in real life. How many works pages did you create leading up to your first real submission? How many works pages from that first submission until your magazine debut? I drew manga and notebooks in 6th grade. One of my manga was a finalist in a contest in my first year of high school. In my final year of high school, they published my Tezuka award-winning work, Wanted. I couldn't give you concrete numbers, but I've drawn every day since the moment I could. What's your approach to creating manga that's readable? Good phraseology? How long does it take to create the storyboards for a single 19-page chapter of manga? I like to finish within 3 days. If it takes longer, I just have to finish the draft quicker. That's interesting because it said, I believe, Gege Akutami takes around 5 days. How long does it take you to finish the full draft for a single 19-page chapter of manga? 3 days, ideally. I'd take all the time in the world if I could. Beyond creating your storyboards, what do you do to come up with your ideas and plot points for your work? I take copious notes on movies and anything remotely inspiring in everyday life. It's too easy to forget stuff otherwise. Is there anything you reference when creating your one-shots? Nothing at all. How naive I was. The internet now makes it easy to look stuff up, and everything you need to know about art is basically sitting there. So I say make use of those resources. Sounds like Oda, for the most part, had it down packed. Next up, Tite Kubo from Bleach and Burn the Witch. What knowledge would have benefited you when starting your manga career? Knowing about pen nibs, ink, types of paper, how to add floating text, meaning text not enclosed in word balloons. To my draft, I didn't know about that last thing until my editor taught me. I started dabbling in digital recently too. Apps, brushes, tools. I didn't know a thing about any of it, so it all feels so fresh and exciting. What did you do first after deciding to become a manga author? I bought a book called something like Primer to Manga Techniques that explained all of the different tools. The info in that book allowed me to create all of my manga. I gotta get my hands on that book. What are you mindful of when revising your own storyboards? In my early days, I firmly believed that taking advice from an editor meant I had somehow lost a battle. Like it would all turn out okay if, even when ignoring the advice, what I created was well received. When you're not feeling confident about this, that, or the other thing, set a time limit for yourself. And if you can't think up a way to improve before the self-imposed deadline, then send it off in spite of your concerns. Don't say, it could have been so much better if only I had more time. The normal response to that is, well, obviously, duh. Is there any way you could have been better prepared before your serialization began? Nope. The learning happens on the job once you're serialized. What do you bear in mind when creating manga? Variety and balance. What's your approach to creating strong, memorable characters? I have to like the characters, or at the very least the potential to like them eventually. When I hate a character, I can't draw them in an appealing way. It's fine to be picky, but strive to broaden the range of what you personally find appealing. How should one practice creating those strong characters? Do it over and over. I mean, that makes sense, right? How many works pages did you create leading up to your first real submission? My first contest entry was a single work of 31 pages. The second one I did was also 31 pages, but the serialization committee told me to add 4 pages, so I bumped it up to 30 pages and it got in the magazine. What's your approach to creating manga that's readable? Stick to vertical and horizontal panels. My editor, when I was starting out, said, you have too many diagonally oriented panels, which really stuck with me. How long does it take to create the storyboards for a single 19-page chapter of manga? 3 days, but the first 3 pages alone can take an entire day. Then I'll reach page 11 on day 2 and finish it on day 3. How long does it take you to finish the full draft for a single 19-page chapter of manga? For a chapter of a serialized work, it takes me 10 to 12 hours to get the art on the page, then another 20 hours once the assistants enter the picture. Beyond creating your storyboards, what do you do to come up with ideas and plot points for your work? I have a notebook to jot down faces and designs I think of. Now I also have a phone app that lets me write down potential dialogue, thoughts, names, items, etc., all categorized in different folders. A lot of those ideas happen to be magic related, partly because I was working on Burn the Witch. Is there anything you reference when creating your one-shots? For Burn the Witch, I watched the Kingsman movie. I remember thinking how in spy fiction, there's something cool about some everyday scenery suddenly flipping around, sometimes literally, to reveal something out of the ordinary, like pulling a book out of a shelf and then magically, hey, there's a freaking, room behind that bookshelf, something like that, I'd imagine. And it sounds like Kubo is just fascinated by the digital era. Next up, we got Demon Slayer's Koyoharo Toge. What knowledge would have benefited you when starting your manga career? Knowing from where to where you're supposed to draw on the draft paper, and how many centimeters of blank space should be left in the middle of the 2 pages for the gutter. What did you do first after deciding to become a manga author? I wanted to get faster at drawing storyboards, so I practiced writing the text alone faster. If you find that's what slows you down, train by just writing back and forth conversations in list form. More generally, you should analyze yourself, polish the skills you have, and work on conquering your weakness as much as possible. What are you mindful of when revising your own storyboards? Make sure the protagonists get more panel time than anyone else. It's best to minimize parts that have nothing to do with your main character or the central plot. I'll even cut whole characters if they don't seem to advance the story. When starting a storyboard, my goal is to tell the story I want to tell in the space I have, and not to be afraid of embarrassment. The criticism from the editor may be brutal, but giving the storyboard your best effort is nothing to be ashamed of. Just take the critique and use it to improve next time. Is there any way you could have been better prepared before your serialization began? I never got to work as an assistant to a manga author, but I bet that would have been a great way to learn and pick up skills. Still, even without that experience, I had so many kind people willing to teach me things, so I guess it all worked out somehow. What do you bear in mind when creating manga? Don't make simple concepts more complex than they have to be. There have been so many instances where I've read a creative work filled with needlessly complex concepts and jargon. In those cases, I can never remember anything. I can't seem to understand what's going on, mostly because I'm a dummy, and I end up dropping whatever it is, which makes me so sad. Is that shots at certain manga? Hey! What's your approach to creating strong, memorable characters? I model characters on family, friends, and other real people in my life. Movies are also a source of inspiration, but I find that nothing beats real, living, breathing people. I don't think it's great to rely solely on inspiration from other fictional works. Try to analyze your own feelings about different people. What makes someone appealing, or unbearable, or worthy of respect? How should one practice creating those strong characters? A character is shaped by their origin, environment, personality, thoughts, words, and actions. Try to probe your character's lives and values until you know them so well that they seem to take on life of their own, where you barely need to think about what they might say or do in any given situation. How many works pages did you create leading up to your first real submission? How many works pages from that first submission until your magazine debut? I've never been much for adding up numbers or math in general, so let's just say I created a lot. What's your approach to creating manga that's readable? Even if the world you're building is complex, don't try to explain it all right off the bat. Most readers will be overwhelmed if you inundate them with waves of unfamiliar terminology and tricky concepts, so keep it nice and simple, especially at the start, and appeal to the senses instead. Wow, that's great advice, I'm not gonna lie. How long does it take to create the storyboards for a single 19-page chapter of manga? 7 to 10 hours. How long does it take to finish the full draft for a single 19-page chapter of manga? About 4 to 5 days, probably. Beyond creating your storyboards, what do you do to come up with the ideas and plot points for your work? I check out the newest and hottest works of fiction out there and analyze them. Same goes for work by especially talented creators. Is there anything you reference when creating your one-shots? I doubt I was able to make much good use of my inspirations, but I've referenced old Japanese folktales, Fujiko F. Fujio's SF Tanpin Theater, Parasite, and Hisatsu Shigotonin, among others. Honestly, it sounds like Koyoharo Toge really likes to keep it very simple and add on to a lot of things that you feel and you're familiar with, basically appealing to the senses, which is so fitting for what Demon Slayer is all about, right? Next up, we got Demizu Posca, the artist of the Promise Neverland. What knowledge would have benefited you when starting your manga career? You can be a manga author without pulling all-nighters, and you don't have to develop calluses from holding pens. Even if you have a weak stomach or are a slow learner or don't have a high follower count, you can set out to do this job. Interesting, I didn't know follower counts is becoming a factor in becoming a manga author. Fun fact, I grip my pencil kind of weakly, so I don't have calluses. During my school days, I thought it would be cool to have calluses, so I tried rubbing my fingers a bunch to grow some. It didn't work. What did you do first after deciding to become a manga author? Don't dwell on, is this good or bad? Just get the work done. Early on, when I was drawing manga with a pen, it took me 1 whole month to finish 5 pages. Get the work done however you can, then show it to an editor. Friends and family might not give you the reaction you're hoping for, but an editor can point out what you've done well. What are you mindful of when revising your own storyboards? It'll all work out as long as your spirit doesn't break. Being motivated by deadlines can be a good thing. Enter every contest you can. For instance, if you endlessly revise, the work will never be finished. I tend to take the editor's advice most of the time, but I firmly believe that doing so is the author's choice. That didn't apply for me on the Promise Neverland since Kayoshida sensei did those storyboards. Is there any way you could have been better prepared before your serialization began? I wish I spent more time talking with friends and observing fun people. Thinking back, a lot of the characters I've created remind me of someone in real life, or wear clothing I've seen somewhere before, or say things that I've been told that really left an impression on me. A bigger stockpile to draw from can be super helpful later on. What do you bear in mind when creating manga? Health comes first. Eat your meals, sleep at night, take walks. Also try not to rely on nutritional supplement drinks. Save those for when your health is really going down the toilet. What's your approach to creating strong, memorable characters? Make every character instantly recognizable by their outward appearance alone, and not just via hairstyle or clothing. Maybe one character has big hands or big feet. A child with big feet will probably end up tall, or clear upper body strength, or an interesting way of standing, or an especially high or low center of gravity, or little gestures they tend to do. Think about every aspect of the body when coming up with a character. Most of that even applies to non-human characters too. Definitely interesting is adding more intricacies, so to speak, into a character aside from, again, like cool hair, cool clothing. Like, no, let's get down to the brass tacks details of every bit of the character. How should one practice creating those strong characters? Try showing off a wide range of characters. The results of that experiment amounts to practice. Back in the day, I made up characters for fun and put them in mini manga stories on social media. Some of those characters were popular with my audience, while others came and went without making a splash. I was thrilled when people liked the character enough to draw fan art, and that inspired me to create better and better characters. How many works pages did you create leading up to your first real submission? How many works pages from that first submission until your magazine debut? I don't remember. During the 10-year gap between my first submission to Jump during high school and my first published work, I probably drew about 1,000 pages of manga for various platforms. What's your approach to creating manga that's readable? Show people what you want to show them. Emphasize those key elements visually and blur out or even omit the stuff that's just supposed to pass by without much notice. For every single panel, page, chapter, and volume, decide what elements you want to show most. That makes a manga readable. How long does it take to create the storyboards for a single 19-page chapter of manga? The underdrawing would take me 2 days after Shidai Sensei did the storyboards. Up to that point, I would probably take 3 weeks to finish 30 pages of storyboarding on my own. How long does it take you to finish the full draft for a single 19-page chapter of manga? About 6 days. 2 days for the underdrawing, 2 days for the line art, and 2 days for finishing. Beyond creating your storyboards, what do you do to come up with ideas and plot points for your work? For my background art, I like to use Street View on a digital map to find and save images of buildings close to what I'm picturing in my head. So I'll often find myself checking out famous locations around the world and wandering around the map, so to speak. When I go out for walks in real life, I'll find interesting buildings, staircases, piping, and things like that, and take pictures. Is there anything you reference when creating your one-shots? Talking with friends, I guess. I've often been given specific genres to work within, so I would talk with other people who were savvy about those genres and find out what exactly drew them in. Now that I'm a proper adult, I guess, I do the same thing, but with actual experts. The Mizu posca definitely sounds like they're very much so living the mangaka lifestyle. Like, yo, if I'm outside and I see a dog that's interesting, I'm taking a picture. Next up, we got the infamous Tatsuki Fujimoto, author of Fire Punch and Chainsaw Man. What knowledge would have benefited you when starting your manga career? I was working digitally, so I wish I'd know exactly how big a draft is supposed to be. I did my research on the internet and even trusted the info on Shueisha's official site, but that info turned out to be wrong. What a mess. What did you do first after deciding to become a manga author? Draw real stuff? Reproducing manga and anime by hand is more like an exercise for people who are already decent at art but need to figure out what good designs look like. So instead, I recommend drawing real people and places. Also, you should always be thinking about what there is to be gained by drawing one thing or another. What are you mindful of when revising your own storyboards? When I hit a stumbling block in the plot, I either alter the main character or scrap that bit of the plot entirely. I understand why people get attached to their work, but if you spend all day, every day staring at your own story, you're bound to lose that essential objectivity. Don't fall too in love with anything you do. kill your darlings. Jesus Christ, Tatsuki. Is there any way you could have been better prepared before your serialization began? Minding my health. What do you bear in mind when creating manga? I try to create scenes that readers will remember until the day they grasp their dying breaths. What's your approach to creating manga that's readable? I take inspiration from people who might exist, who do exist, or who I might have seen somewhere. I'm not sure really. How should one practice creating those strong characters? I never have. How many works pages did you create leading up to your first real submission? How many works pages from that first submission until your magazine debut? 7 or 8 different works, I think. What's your approach to creating manga that's readable? Keep the text and explanations to a minimum. That's so facts. That's literally what Chainsaw Man is. Show, not tell. How long does it take to create the storyboards for a single 19-page chapter of manga? 1 or 2 days. How long does it take to finish the full draft for a single 19-page chapter of manga? 4 to 6 days. Beyond creating your storyboards, what do you do to come up with ideas and plot points for your work? Nothing. Is there anything you reference when creating your one-shots? I watched movies. Hey, goodbye Eddie. Goddamn, Tatsuki Fujimoto is a funny lad. Next up, we got Kohei Hodakoshi, author of My Hero Academia. What knowledge would have benefited you when starting your manga career? Knowing about perspective and art and human emotions. What did you do first after deciding to become a manga author? I started by reading a bunch of one-shots in Akamaru Jump and first chapters of various series. I analyzed them to see how many pages they needed to achieve good characterization, or how the chapters were split up in terms of setup, rising action, climax, conclusion. Damn, he did it like a scientist. Then I systematically recorded all this data. I don't know how useful the data itself ended up being, but the act of breaking down published works like that deepened my understanding of manga as a medium at least a little. What are you mindful of when revising your own storyboards? I envision what it's going to be like when the chapter runs in the magazine. I have a keen awareness that it's going to be read by real people. When the editor gives a suggestion I don't agree with, I push back and duke it out. I knock that muff. No. Because nothing good can come from implementing a suggestion I just can't accept deep down. It wouldn't make sense. Is there any way you could have been better prepared before your serialization began? I could have been better prepared in every way possible. What do you bear in mind when creating manga? How unsightly or awesome it can be when a character is covered in filth and struggling desperately, having them rise up from that. What's your approach to creating manga that's readable? I want readers to have zero doubt about how much care and attention I pay to my characters. This usually comes in the form of the little details like expressions, gestures, and so on. How should one practice creating those strong characters? There are times I've realized that not drawing something is the key. For instance, say you have a character who's laughing out loud. You might make them roll around on the floor and kick their legs wildly, but those sort of cliche gestures are just default visual coding within the medium. That isn't always bad per se, but instead, try thinking about how your character specifically would act in that situation. How many works pages did you create leading up to your first real submission? How many works pages from that first submission until your magazine debut? Just one work, 31 pages long. The first manga I created was picked up. From there until my first serialization, I guess I had another 1.5 series. What's your approach to creating manga that's readable? As a medium, manga is read by moving from one word balloon to the next, so I'm careful about their placement. Lately, I've been on a kick with close-ups. How long does it take to create the storyboards for a single 19-page chapter of manga? 2 to 3.5 days. How long does it take you to finish the full draft for a single 19-page chapter of manga? 4 to 5 days. Beyond creating your storyboards, what do you do to come up with ideas and plot points for your work? Lots of doodling. As I'm drawing, the ideas will pop into my head and or crystallize into something usable. Is there anything you reference when creating your one-shots, Akamaru Jump, and various first chapters? Next up, we got Hideaki Sorachi, the Troll King himself, author of Gintama. What knowledge would have benefited you when starting your manga career? We often see publicly available information about how pros with a team of assistants might split up their time and workload when trying to finish a draft, but you rarely see authors talk about doing all that work alone. Despite the fact that that's the reality of it for most new authors, I think a lot of newcomers have their spirits crack under the weight of the overwhelming workload and end up giving up on their unfinished drafts. It would behoove them to hear a bit about the need to be mentally prepared for all that. My first ever draft had me writing in agony for half a year. The manga author's journey is at its most brutal right at the start. What did you do first after deciding to become a manga author? Introspection. I analyzed myself and reflected on my best weapons to take into battle and my worst ones. I decided what I would set out to do and what I wouldn't, with as much self-awareness as possible. What are you mindful of when revising your own storyboards? I give my storyboards a fresh look and re-examine what role each page will play. For instance, one page might be the free page that comes before a big gag, so which panels does it absolutely need and which can it do without? I tend to have my metaphorical writer's camera pulled way back at first, but then I zoom in more and and more until the details of the picture come into focus. That's the best way I found to fix up my work. Is there any way you could have been better prepared before your serialization began? Having a stockpile of character designs to draw from in advance, creating characters from scratch while working on a weekly series? Woof, that's rough, both mentally and physically. What do you bear in mind when creating manga? I'm always searching for the intersection point of what I want to draw and what readers want to read. When there's a lot of those intersections, that equals more opportunities to stop and take a breather. But if you only have one of those two lines to start with, you'll be caught up in one-way traffic and will just have to go with the flow. What's your approach to creating strong, memorable characters? I decided from the start what a given character is allowed to do and what they aren't, and to make the character follow those rules to a T at first. That's fundamental. If the author and reader don't have a basic shared understanding about the essence of a character, then by definition, the author can never do anything shocking or unexpected with the character to win them more fans. Next, create settings and stories that force you to loosen the rules that constrain your character. Ultimately, I believe readers want to see characters acting like themselves at times, but also not at other times. How should one practice creating those strong characters? When you find that you're fond of someone in life, analyze how your own feelings on them evolve. Cases where you were a huge fan of someone from the start are less useful than experiences where you disliked someone at first and they ended up growing on you. For example, there might be some foul, disgusting creep of an actor who's obnoxiously handsome, but there comes those rare moments when he says just the right thing on a variety show that makes you go, huh, he's not all bad. At that moment, drop what you're doing and run that self-analysis to figure out what's going on in your head. Why did you hate him originally? What changed? As someone creating characters, you have to be able to control that likable versus unlikable dial however you see fit. How long does it take to create the storyboards for a single 19-page chapter of manga? 3 to 5 days. How long does it take to finish the full draft for that 19-page chapter? 2 to 3 days. Beyond creating your storyboards, what do you do to come up with ideas and plot points for your work? I consume lots of manga, movies, books, anime, and video games. I take note of story patterns and turn them into my personal stockpile of ideas. More specifically, I write down stuff I find interesting or boring and then think about why I felt that way. It's my eternal homework, assignment, and hobby. Is there anything you reference when creating your one-shots? My grand challenge was being more concise with my stories, so I read all the Akamaru Jump one-shots I could find and compared how each author approached their page distribution to my own approach, which helped make progress. The tricks to cutting down on length are knowing when the scene changes should happen, knowing how long to spend on each scene, and cutting everything that can be cut. One of Jump's older sister magazines known as Jump Gege. And that was 9 of the 15 interviews. There was a bunch other. I'll link in the description below. Let me know what you guys think. Did you gain any insight from these incredible author interviews? I'm ForneverWorld, and as always, people, have an awesome day. And yeah, subscribe and hit that bell, baby.